Hi everyone, I'm Leanne and today I'm going to be reviewing all of the books that I read in January. So I read 13 books in the month. 3 of those were books that I read for work. 1 of them I borrowed, and 9 books came off my physical TBR, which means I'm almost allowed to haul 2 books. If you watched my kind of reading goals, intentions video, you'll know that I implemented a new rule where I can only bring a book onto my shelves once 5 books have come off my physical TBR, whether that's through me reading them or unhauling books that I haven't read yet. When it comes to my work reading, I have decided that anything that comes onto my shelves and I read in 2026, they don't count. They kind of just cancel each other out. I am counting books that I have from work that I brought onto my shelves last year or earlier. Oh, actually, I think that brings us up to 10 books coming off my physical TBR then. Anyway, you're here for the reviews, not my weird, slightly nonsensical rules that I've given myself. So one of the first books that I read in the month was Frankie by Graham Norton, and I had sort of identified this as one of the books that I wanted to read early on in the year because I wanted to get my reading year off to such a good start, and this felt like such a reliable place to go. And it was. So this story begins in London, where we are following Damien, who is a young Irishman who is a carer in London, and he is sent to take care of Frankie, who is a fellow Irish person in her 80s living in London. And Frankie begins to open up to Damien and tell her stories of her life, so when she was a girl in Ireland and the various places that her life took her. So London, and then to America, then eventually back to London. And essentially, this is Frankie's life story. You see the really difficult situation that she went through in Ireland, which is largely framed by kind of the influence of the Catholic Church, the misogyny that young women faced at that time, the lack of freedom that women had. And I say women, but Frankie is really a girl when this happens to her. You see her escape to London and find herself socially mixing in circles she never would have imagined existed, never mind finding herself in. And like how circumstances somewhat beyond her control meant that she had to go to London, she then finds herself in New York, largely due to circumstances beyond her control. And her life in New York is so embroiled in kind of restaurant culture. She's a chef while she's there, but also the art world. And they are both worlds that, I don't really know anything about. I like going to restaurants and I like eating and I like going to museums, but I don't really know anything about the food or art worlds. So it was really fascinating to see those worlds and those cultures in New York. It's a novel largely about how lives take paths that you may not have expected. And it's also a book about memory and legacy and what we leave behind and what we mean to other people. I don't have many older people in my life. My final living grandparent died 15 years ago. And I do feel an absence of older people and their stories and their experiences in my life. So I really valued hearing about Frankie's life because I'm sure there are so many people that have lived lives like hers. And I found so much value in being part of her story. I also read Good Material by Dolly Alderton. So this novel is about the breakup and aftermath between a man and a woman, told from the perspective of the man, until the very end of the novel when we get a different perspective from the woman in this relationship. And in so many ways, I'm not sure exactly how I feel about this book. So this male character that we are hearing the perspective from is a kind of somewhat struggling stand-up comedian. In the aftermath of this breakup, we see him kind of at various crossroads and floundering in terms of his career, his friendships, his living situation. And I think we so often see that perspective in novels from women about the female experience. So the premise of seeing it from the male perspective, I think, is a really actually valuable one. However, this is a book that is written by Dolly Alderton, a woman, kind of imagining herself, putting herself in the shoes of a man that she clearly doesn't like. So much of this book is this man behaving in a certain way, and he's a very kind of unreliable narrator. And I think as a woman who has, navigated the dating scene and had breakup, you do bring a certain amount of baggage to this book in how you interpret his behaviors. You're almost kind of like the lies that he is telling himself and the way he is telling his story, where you kind of feel like that there's a different perspective to it that would give a different version of events. He is a narrator that is kind of trying to elicit your sympathy, but you really see through it. I suppose what I'm trying to articulate about why I'm not fully sure how much this worked for me is because I felt like I could see the cogs turning. This is a novel about a heterosexual breakup where the male perspective is clearly not accurate. I just felt like I could see what the writer was trying to do, rather than feeling like a genuine exploration of the male experience. I could see the female author at work, rather than buying into this as a genuine story. Does that make sense? Basically, I'd like to read a book like this by a self-aware man. Any recommendations? Let me know. Oh, also, because I could see all those cogs turning, it kind of rendered the female perspective at the end, I just didn't need it. It felt like it was hammering something home that it was already home. It was already there. I read Funny Story by Emily Henry. So at the beginning of this book, we have two heterosexual couples. One of them is about to get married, and the man in that relationship is best friends with the woman in the other relationship. And before the engaged couple get married, the two best friends end up cheating and getting together, ending their mutual relationships. Circumstances unfold, and it means that the woman and the man that were broken up with end up moving in together. And you can see where it unfolds from there. It does end up in a kind of fake dating scenario because these two people are kind of performing a really kind of happy, fun life together. They start by kind of getting people curious about whether they're together, and then they kind of end up fake dating, and then it goes from there. I had a nice time with this one. I liked the fact that our female lead was a children's librarian. That brought me a lot of joy. But the whole setup of this book was just too messy and confusing for me. Even trying to describe it to you just now, I felt myself getting confused. I had a fun time with this, but for me, my favorite Emily Henry is You and Me on Vacation. I haven't dived into the world of what your favorite Emily Henry novel means about you. And I feel with books like this, there is so much to do with the time you read it. I will continue to read Emily Henry books. I think she's a great writer, but I'm always comparing her books to You and Me on Vacation. I read another romance book. I read First Time Caller by B.K. Barson. Now, I have been saying that I want to read fewer romance books set in America, and then I've read two. But you know what? I really enjoyed this one. All of the people that recommended this author to me were correct. So this is the romance between Aidan and Lucy, and Aidan is the host of a dating radio show in local radio, and one day a young girl phones in asking for advice for her mother, who is Lucy. And that opening part of the book where you have this little girl on the phone with this radio host, and then her mother discovers her talking to this man. It's a very funny setup. It's a great opening to this book. And that ends up going viral. It brings so much attention to the show, and so many people want Lucy back on the airwaves, kind of in this co-hosting role with Aidan. And as is the case with romance books, I'm sure you can predict where it's going to go from there. It begins as a will they, won't they kind of workplace romance, to them secretly hooking up, and that was very fun. And that is my main review of this book. It was a lot of fun, but there was also lots of other stuff happening in the kind of sphere of both of these characters that made for a really interesting dynamic. So Aidan's family situation is quite complicated. Lucy is in a kind of non-traditional, non-nuclear kind of family setup. So Lucy has her daughter, and her daughter's father is very much in her life along with his boyfriend / husband, and loved that family setup for everyone involved. It was just a beautiful non-nuclear depiction of how families can look. And also how this book touched on quite serious things like Lucy's experiences of being a woman with a public profile and how difficult that can be. So yeah, a lot of fun with this one. I read a Frida. I read One by One by Frida McFadden. This is my 5th Frida McFadden book. And once again, I read it cover to cover in one sitting. Me and my boyfriend had an evening where we both just sat on the sofa and read our books for like a couple hours, and it was glorious. This is my least favourite Frida that I have read though. And well, hold on, before I get into that, let me tell you what it's about. So we are following Claire, who desperately needs like a break from her work and her children. So she and her husband and 2 other couples are going for this like trip away where they're going to be like hiking and hot tubbing to like escape the pressures of their lives. But we know from the outset that Claire is quite unhappy in her marriage. One thing leads to another. Their car ends up breaking down and they end up lost in this like forest. And as the title suggests, one by one, something very bad happens to the people on the trip. And throughout the book, there's suspicions around who may have ulterior motives. I don't know if this book just wasn't as good as other Frida McFadden books I'd read, or now that I've read, like, this is the 5th one, I can see the inner workings a little bit more. So I did predict, like, basically almost entirely how this unfolded. You know, now that I've read a few of them, I think I can see where she's trying to get me not to look. So I look there. But I still had a good time. Like, I am never gonna complain about being able to read a book cover to cover in one sitting in an evening. Like, that is always gonna be fun for me, even if I can now see some of the inner workings. But yeah, I don't know if I just kind of know the formula a bit more now, or if this one just wasn't as good as some of the other ones I'd read. I read The Bones Beneath My Skin by TJ Klune. So this is set in the spring of 1995, the year I was born, and we are following Nate Cartwright, who's at a bit of a loose ends in his life. His parents have just died, his older brother doesn't really want anything to do with him, and he's just been fired from his job. So he ends up returning to his family's, like, cabin, and when he arrives there, he is expecting it to be empty, but there is in fact a man there and what seems to be a young girl. And the young girl is very unusual, very strange. The way she speaks, the things that she comes up with, there's something very like uncanny valley about her. And Nate is very suspicious around like who both of these people are, why they're in this cabin, how did they get there, why is this little girl the way she is, what is her relationship to this man. And he becomes deeper and deeper embroiled in their kind of crazy situation that does have like sci-fi elements to it. I really enjoyed maybe like 2/3 of this book. I found the last third of it really began to drag. I don't think it's necessarily a fault with the book, it's just kind of like a personal preference thing. Like when it was them in the cabin and things were all like very mysterious and quirky, I really enjoyed that. And then in the final third of the book, it becomes far more like high stakes. And that's where I began to disengage with it a little bit. But in saying all of that, I definitely really enjoyed this one. This is the second TJ Klune book that I've read, and I definitely want to read more of his writing. I think the type of SFF that he does works really well for me as someone who isn't a typical like fantasy or science fiction reader. There is a coziness to his books that I don't find in some other works in this genre. And I also love how he also incorporates like queer relationships into his novels too. And this little girl is such a unique character that I loved spending time with. So overall, I did really enjoy this one. I also read a classic. I read Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So mixed response to this one. I mean, I can definitely see why The Great Gatsby is more well known than Tender is the Night. And this is quite literally like a tale of two halves. So it's largely set on the French Riviera in the first portion of the book. And I loved that as a setting. I thought it was really beautifully, almost like a character in itself. And we are following a young actress. I think she's like 17. Her career has been very successful. She goes to the French Riviera and she finds herself an outsider to this kind of echelon of society made up of Americans and Europeans who have the wealth to kind of spend their time on the French Riviera. And she is particularly drawn to a couple called the Divers. And where we think this book is going to go is essentially an affair between this young actress and, I mean, his name is Dick Diver, so I just cannot take this man seriously. But we think the book is going to be about an affair between the pair of them. And then like halfway through, the narrative goes like back in time and we are seeing the origins of the relationship between Dick and his wife, Nicole. The novel largely becomes about kind of power dynamics and being mentally unwell. Nicole and Dick begin their relationship when Nicole is a patient of Dick's. He is like a psychotherapist or like psychoanalyst. I don't quite know the distinction. And we see the fragility in both of their individual lives, but also the fragility in their relationship. So we begin the novel with this kind of exterior perspective, someone looking in on this relationship. And the second half of the novel is more the interiority of that relationship. I found it interesting to see how, similarly to The Great Gatsby, there is a gap between how people are perceived and who they really are and how people perform success. How glamour is something that is like performed, I found really interesting. But I did feel like there was an imbalance between these two halves of the novel. Like they are, I think, fairly 50-50 in how long they last. And it just means that in the first half of the book, you spend so much time getting to know this actress. And there are so many like surrounding characters that actually end up being irrelevant and not important. And maybe that's kind of the point, that these people are kind of like caricatures, they're like kind of dispensable, they could be anyone. But you spend so much time thinking that's going to be the book, and that is not really the book. So I think that's why I have quite a mixed response to this book. And also, when I've seen other people talk about this book, there's very little discussion around the racial elements of the novel. The way Black bodies are treated is not good. And I specifically say Black bodies because they're not really characters. Like, they're caricatures. They're treated as like dispensable plot devices with no kind of interiority of character. You know, when a person is killed, the way it's presented is to like elicit shock and spectacle rather than sympathy and upset. Some of the language used is unacceptable/uncomfortable, and there's no real acknowledgement of the fact that the wealth of many of these characters would be built on colonization. So that is something that I would want people to be aware of before they go into this book, because I had no idea, and I found so much of it like a very unpleasant reading experience for those reasons. Okay, that is all the fiction for adults, but I do have some poetry/personal writing in Slug by Holly McNish. So for a long time, Holly McNish was one of my favourite poets, and she still is one of my favorite poets. She writes in a very kind of colloquial, rhyme-heavy way that I really enjoy. And largely a lot of the topics that she writes about are things that I'm really interested in. So like kind of the female experience, feminism. She writes in a way that is very, like, I kind of want to use the word accessible, but I feel like there's a certain amount of like baggage that comes with the word accessible when people think it just means like not very clever, and that's not the case. Like, this is very clever poetry, and I think in some ways it's actually more challenging to write in a way that feels everyday and incredibly poetic. So I really love her style of writing. This is a collection of poems that are kind of categorized together thematically, and there's also like kind of personal writing and essays accompanying the poems. And I thought that was a really interesting choice in that, you know, it's what is often done at spoken word or like slam poetry events. You give a bit of context to the poems, and I think the reason that so many people often struggle with poetry is because it is presented without context. And the personal writing that accompanies these poems gives a lot of context. And I don't want to say I didn't enjoy those personal essays, but for me, I found some of them, I just didn't need them. I was kind of rushing through them because I wanted to get to the poems. Like, in many ways, I kind of just want to reread this and just read the poetry. And that is because I enjoy the poetry, you know, so much. As I said, the way she writes in quite a rhyme-heavy, straightforward way, I really love. And thematically, I love how much she kind of explores female experience and women's bodies. So I did really, really love this one, but would just like to read the poems, I think. I read a young adult book. I read Skip Shock by Caroline O'Donoghue. Caroline is one of my favourite authors. I have really enjoyed her books for adults and her books for young adults. This wasn't my favourite of what she has written. I definitely prefer like all of the books she's written for adults, and I definitely prefer the first book in her YA trilogy, All Our Hidden Gifts, more than this one. This is about Margot, who on a mysterious train journey finds herself transported to like another dimension where time doesn't function in the same way that it does in our world. So time is very much like quite literally a kind of commodity, where the wealthier you are, the more hours in a day that you have. So if you are less wealthy, your days are shorter. So there's kind of less opportunity for you if you have shorter days. And when she is transported to this other dimension on this train, she meets Moon, who is a traveling salesman. And Moon's motivations throughout the book are complicated because he does want to help Margot, and he also really fancies her and she really fancies him. But he also appreciates that way in which Margot has ended up transported to this other dimension is incredibly complicated, and it has kind of wider ramifications than him just trying to like help this girl out. Like, it is huge. And in particular, because this is a society that is on the brink of war. And there being this girl that can transport in different dimensions, that has huge ramifications in a war that is so largely based on like time. I don't know what it was about this book that just didn't work for me as much as other books by this author have. I personally feel like this should have been an adult novel, but perhaps that's an oversimplification of why I just wasn't as engaged with this one. Maybe it is because I just don't like sci-fi that much. Like, as I said with the TJ Klune book, like, he hits a very specific sweet spot for me. And when it did stray into being more of the kind of action-packed, like, political strand of that book, I found it less interesting. And, you know, maybe that's also why parts of this book didn't work for me. It took me a very long time to read this. Like, I didn't find myself with the compulsion to return to it when I put it down. So it took like basically the whole month for me to read it. But I don't know why this one didn't work as well for me. Maybe it is a case of I had such high expectations going into it that my expectations were just never going to be met, so it's my fault and not the book's fault. I don't know. And then for younger readers, I read Land of the Last Wildcat by Lu Cit. So this is a middle grade animal adventure about a girl named Puffin whose scientist mother hardly speaks to her. And it's also about Puffin's relationship to a mythical wildcat called the Curry, who is incredibly precious and magical and is dependent on Puffin for survival. And the villain of this story is a professor who wants to capture the Curry for its magical properties. And it is up to Puffin and her friend to evade this money-hungry scientist to protect this cat. So it's a book that is largely about, you know, choosing to do the right thing. It's a book about kind of questioning people's motivations. It's a book about science. It's a book about the environment and protecting wildlife. So topics that I think it is incredibly important for children to engage with in terms of, you know, protecting their environment in particular and protecting wildlife. I have read a few other middle grade books that deal with similar topics recently, so I don't know if I was just slightly kind of fatigued of that. So some parts of this story I kind of felt very familiar with for that reason. But nonetheless, it was really beautifully told. The landscape was really beautifully expressed. And I think there are so many kids that are just really interested in like science and animals, and this would be really great for them. And then very quickly, the books that I read for work were The Silver Kingdom, Postman Planet, and Ice Apprentice's The Frozen Curse. So that's it. They are all of the books that I read in January. I feel like this is going to be quite a long video, so thank you for sticking around if you have. In honor of first time caller, can you leave me a phone emoji if you don't have anything in particular to say? But if you have read any of these books and you want to share your thoughts on them, do leave me a comment down below. If you have any recommendations for me based on what I thought of these books, I would love to hear them. My reading month in February has already got off to a really great start, and of course we have recently announced the Irish Readathon, so I'm already really excited for my reading in the next month. So I look forward to talking to you about all of those books. That's it for me today. I hope you're well, and I'll speak to you in my next video.